If you're trying to imagine the future of climate change in Boston, you had two chances in recent weeks. That's when the usual boundaries between land and water were shifted by king tides. To study the effect and spread awareness about rising sea levels, organizations such as Boston Harbor Now made a call for documentation. To share the results is our guest from Boston Harbor Now, the Vice President of Policy and Planning, Julie Wormser. Thank you very much for being with us, Julie.
Nice to see you, Chris.
Last time you were here, Julie, you were with the Boston Harbor Association, so explain what's become of these groups.
That's right. We joined forces with our closest colleagues, the Boston Harbor Island Alliance, saying let's build on our history of success of creating a national park out in the islands, cleaning up Boston Harbor, reestablishing the waterfront. Now it's time to take Boston to a whole new level.
Julie, I want to ask you about, when we're talking about these higher levels here, there's one photo that was contributed recently showing a piece of the Harbor Walk, one of your projects there.
That's right.
Explain that.
Actually in the harbor, for sure. So in the fall, typically, we get what's called king tides. So the moon is closest to the Earth in its orbit, and we have a full moon where the moon and the sun are pulling in the same direction. So we have the highest astronomical tide of the year. This year we had that twice, both in October and November. So we can have 2.5 feet higher than a normal high tide. It gives us a preview of what we can expect sometime after mid-century because of sea level rise.
Now, there is another photo here that showed some building on the waterfront, maybe along Wharf, and saying if I were living there, I would be nervous. So explain what was going on there during the king tide.
You sure wouldn't want to store anything in the basement. Yeah, so you're looking at the Custom House block on Long Wharf, and this is one of the oldest parts of the city. Our ancestors, when they built our infrastructure in the 1800s, 1700s even, they never contemplated sea level rise. They knew that we had a protected harbor, we don't get huge storm surges, so they built everything really close to the harbor so they could access it with boats. Now with just a couple feet of sea level rise, we're going to start to see chronic flooding.
And speaking of chronic flooding, there was one shot from Dorchester that actually looked familiar to me because I'd seen this kind of sea level before during Hurricane Sandy.
That's right.
This is the playground at Tinny Hen Beach.
Exactly.
Now it's an aquatic playground, I guess.
I know, it's not really intended to be aquatic, but you were mentioning before, hey, wait a minute, this looked a lot like Hurricane Sandy, and you're absolutely right. Our highest storm tide, so storm surge plus high tide, our highest storm tide in Sandy was high tide plus 2.5 feet because Sandy peaked at low tide. What we're seeing here with the king tide is high tide plus 2.5 feet just because of the tide. So we can get coastal flooding from a combination of a wicked high tide, of the high tide itself, and a storm surge, and then underlying sea level rise. It's a little bit like a little kid in a bathtub. If you have a tantrumy kid, you want only a little bit of water in that bathtub. Once that water gets higher and higher and higher, you need to be very careful or that water is going to go right over the top of your bathtub. Same with us. As sea level rise goes higher and higher, a smaller and smaller storm is going to overtop our seawalls.
We're talking with Julie Wormser from Boston Harbor Now. Put this into another perspective because we have these things that happen every so often, like the big moon.
Yeah.
And people might say, all right, so we had a couple of king tides, but it's almost like a footnote. Or is it something that's happening more often right now?
Well, we've seen over a foot of sea level rise already since the 1800s. 100 years ago, we'd see flooding like we just saw 4 times this fall, once every 2 years. Now it's starting to happen a few times a year. So what you call nuisance flooding is becoming more and more common, but also with more heat in the weather system, our storms are getting stronger. So we have this unfortunate confluence of sea level creeping up and storms getting more intense. The probability of a flood is just getting higher and higher.
Well, talk about what this means for your main concerns at Boston Harbor Now. And one of them is about, well, the development. And because certainly anybody who's going to spend a lot of money to put a building up would certainly take this into consideration.
Yeah. Well, we are undergoing a historic housing boom, building boom. As you know, we've never seen this much building in Boston's history as we are right now in the last 5 years. Unfortunately, almost all of those buildings were permitted before the Great Recession, before anybody, including us, was thinking about sea level rise, especially it happening so quickly. So there's a lot of building that were already had their engineering designs completed, their environmental permitting completed, and they went in as is. The newest buildings, especially in East Boston, they're starting to look at how can we put our mechanicals out of harm's way, how can we put our foundations a few feet taller, such that we at least buy ourselves some decades.
What about public access to the waterfront?
Well, something we've been working on for years is the Boston Harbor Walk, and that is a 12-foot wide, 50-foot long, almost, public walkway. I can imagine over time, as we start to see flooding, maybe we'll elevate that walkway and it'll become Boston's dry line instead of New York's high line, right? That still gives us access to the water, but protects us from flooding.
We should mention that if anybody wants to add to the documentation, there's a website where this is all being pooled.
I also want to give a shout out to our colleagues. So we worked with New England Aquarium, Museum of Science, UMass Boston, Mass Bays program, and there's a website called mycoast.org where you can upload your photos. If they're already time-stamped and geo-stamped, that website will know where your picture was taken, or you can fiddle with that once you upload your pictures. And then we will have all these photos up and down the Massachusetts coast. And it's very helpful for scientists.
Thank you very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Julie Wormser from Boston Harbor Now.